Welcome to a chapter a day. Listen closely. Your life is not limited by opportunity. It is limited by the level of reality you are operating from. Most people believe they live in one world, the physical world. The world of money, work, results, responsibilities, and circumstances. But that belief hides one of the most important truths about human existence. You are not living in one world. You are living in three: the physical world, the mental world, and the deeper spiritual world that silently directs both. Most people spend their entire lives trying to change the physical world alone. They push harder. They chase better opportunities. They search for motivation. But something strange happens. The harder they push, the more life seems to repeat the same patterns, the same frustrations, the same limitations, the same invisible ceilings. Why? Because reality does not begin on the physical plane. Reality begins on the mental plane, and it is stabilized by the spiritual plane. When these three planes are disconnected, life feels chaotic. But when these three planes are aligned, something extraordinary happens. Decisions become clearer. Confidence becomes natural. Opportunities begin to appear where they never existed before. And this is the discovery that changes everything. The people who seem to move through life with unusual clarity, the ones who build meaningful success, the ones who remain calm while others panic, are not necessarily more talented. They simply learned how to operate on all three planes of existence. And once you understand how these planes interact, you stop reacting to reality. You begin shaping it. In this audiobook, you're going to uncover the hidden mechanics that quietly shape every decision, every habit, and every result in your life. And once you see these patterns clearly, you will never experience your reality the same way again. Chapter 1: The Three Invisible Worlds You Are Living In. Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing that the world you thought you understood was only a fraction of the truth. Most people move through life believing there is only one world, the physical world, the world of objects, the world of responsibilities, the world of bills, jobs, schedules, deadlines, and visible results. It feels solid, measurable, real. You can touch it. You can see it. You can feel its pressure every day. And because it feels so immediate, most people believe that this physical world is where life truly happens. But there is something strange about that assumption. If the physical world was the true source of reality, then two people standing in the exact same situation would always respond the same way. But they don't. Two people can receive the same opportunity. One hesitates. The other moves forward with certainty. Two people can face the same setback. One collapses under the weight of it. The other quietly adapts and keeps moving. Two people can grow up in similar circumstances. One repeats familiar struggles. The other slowly transforms their entire life. The physical situation is the same, yet the outcome becomes completely different. So something else must be operating beneath the surface. Something unseen. Something powerful. And when you begin to look closely, a pattern starts to emerge. Human experience does not operate on one plane. It operates on three. Three invisible worlds are interacting every moment of your life: the physical plane, the mental plane, and the spiritual plane. The physical plane is the world most people are familiar with. It is the world of visible outcomes: your career, your finances, your health, your relationships, your environment. It is the world where results appear. But here is the first realization many people overlook. The physical world is not the place where reality begins. It is the place where reality arrives. The physical world is the scoreboard. It displays the final result of processes that began somewhere deeper. And that deeper level is the second plane, the mental plane. This is the world of thoughts, ideas, interpretations, expectations, decisions. Every action you take begins here. Before you speak, a thought appears. Before you change direction, an interpretation forms. Before you pursue an opportunity, your mind quietly evaluates whether it feels possible. And most of these processes happen so quickly that you rarely notice them. But they are constantly shaping your behavior. Think about something simple for a moment. Imagine someone invites you to do something unfamiliar. Maybe it is a new opportunity. Maybe it is a chance to lead something important. Maybe it is an experience that pushes you slightly outside your comfort zone. The moment you hear the invitation, something happens internally. A thought appears. Sometimes the thought says, "I could do that." Other times the thought says, "I'm not sure I'm ready." The physical situation is identical, but the mental interpretation changes the outcome. One thought creates movement. Another thought creates hesitation. And this leads us to an important truth about how reality unfolds. The physical world reflects what the mental world rehearses. Let that sentence settle for a moment. The physical world reflects what the mental world rehearses. Before something becomes an action, it becomes a thought. Before it becomes a result, it becomes a decision. And those decisions are guided by the patterns your mind has practiced repeatedly. But even the mental plane has a deeper influence beneath it. Because where do your thoughts come from? Why do certain ideas feel natural while others feel uncomfortable? Why do some possibilities feel believable while others feel distant? This brings us to the third plane, the spiritual plane. Now, when people hear the word spiritual, they often imagine religion or mystical ideas. But in this context, the spiritual plane refers to something much more fundamental. It is the plane of identity. It is the level where your deepest beliefs about yourself live. The quiet story you carry about who you are. The assumptions you rarely question. Statements like, "I'm the kind of person who," "I've always been someone who," "This is just how I am." These sentences may seem harmless, but they are powerful. Because identity quietly filters every thought you allow yourself to believe. And those thoughts determine the actions you are willing to take, which eventually determines the results you experience in the physical world. So when we step back and observe the process carefully, we begin to see a chain reaction. Identity influences thought. Thought influences action. Action creates physical outcomes. 3 planes, working together constantly. The spiritual plane defines identity. The mental plane generates thought. The physical plane produces results. And when these planes are aligned, something remarkable begins to happen. Life starts to feel clearer. Decisions become easier. Progress feels less like struggle and more like momentum. But when these planes are misaligned, life begins to feel confusing. You might try to change your physical circumstances without updating the mental patterns behind them. You might try to force new habits while still carrying an old identity. And this is where many people unknowingly trap themselves. They fight the visible world without ever examining the invisible forces shaping it. Pause for a moment and think about your own life. Has there ever been a moment when a belief about yourself suddenly changed? Maybe someone told you something that made you see your abilities differently. Maybe you realized you were capable of more than you previously assumed. Maybe a single insight shifted how you approach challenges. And almost immediately, your behavior changed. You spoke differently. You acted differently. You approached situations with a new level of confidence. What changed? The physical world around you was the same, but the identity you were operating from had shifted. And because identity changed, your thoughts reorganized. Your thoughts produced different actions, and those actions began creating new results. This is how powerful the deeper planes truly are. Most people try to redesign their life from the outside in, but lasting transformation almost always happens from the inside out. Identity reshapes thought. Thought reshapes behavior. Behavior reshapes reality. And when you begin observing life through this lens, you start noticing something fascinating. Many of the limitations people struggle with are not external barriers. They are internal patterns. Patterns that formed gradually. Patterns that were never consciously chosen. But patterns that continue influencing decisions every single day. The moment you start recognizing these patterns, something shifts. You begin realizing that the visible world around you is not the starting point of reality. It is the final expression of deeper processes. And when you learn to influence those deeper processes, your experience of reality begins to change. Not through force, but through alignment. Because when identity, thought, and action begin working together, progress becomes natural. Clarity replaces confusion. And effort begins producing meaningful results. But there is a crucial detail many people still miss. Understanding the three planes is only the first step. Because knowing they exist does not automatically mean you are using them wisely. In fact, most people unknowingly spend their entire lives operating almost entirely on one plane. Some people live only on the physical plane. They work harder and harder, believing effort alone will change everything. Others live almost entirely on the mental plane. They analyze endlessly, thinking about possibilities without ever taking action. And some drift through life without ever examining the identity shaping their decisions. Each of these approaches creates imbalance, and imbalance creates frustration. So the real question becomes this: what happens when someone tries to change their life while operating from only one plane? That question leads us directly into the next discovery. Because understanding this imbalance explains why so many people feel stuck even while trying their hardest to move forward. You now understand the three invisible worlds shaping your experience. But the next step is even more revealing. Because the world most people rely on the most is also the world that creates the greatest illusion. You've just discovered the hidden structure of reality. Now it's time to examine the plane where most people spend their entire lives struggling. Chapter 2. The Physical Plane, Why Reality Feels So Heavy. There is a quiet belief that shapes the way most people live their lives. It is rarely spoken out loud, yet it silently influences decisions, priorities, and daily behavior. The belief is simple. If you want a better life, you must push harder in the physical world. Work harder. Earn more. Fix the visible problems. Improve the external circumstances. From the moment people enter adulthood, this idea begins guiding their efforts. More hours, more productivity, more responsibility. And at first, this approach seems logical. After all, the physical world is where the results appear. If you want a better career, you change jobs. If you want more income, you pursue new opportunities. If you want a better environment, you change your surroundings. Everything appears to revolve around visible action. So people push. They chase. They grind. They sacrifice time and energy believing that if they apply enough pressure to the external world, life will eventually transform. But after years of effort, something strange often begins to happen. The progress feels slower than expected. The same types of problems keep appearing. The same frustrations repeat themselves in slightly different forms. Someone may improve their financial situation, yet still feel uncertain about the future. Another person may change environments, yet find themselves repeating similar conflicts with different people. Someone might finally achieve a long-desired goal, only to discover that the satisfaction fades faster than they imagined. It begins to feel like running on a treadmill. Movement is happening. Effort is real. But the deeper sense of change remains just out of reach. And this leads many people to an uncomfortable question. Why does life sometimes feel so heavy? Why does improvement often require so much force? Why does progress feel like constant resistance? To understand this, we must revisit the idea introduced in the previous chapter. The three planes of existence: the physical plane, the mental plane, and the spiritual plane. Most people spend nearly all of their time operating on the first one, the physical plane, the world of visible outcomes. This is where the consequences of decisions appear. But here is the realization that changes everything. The physical plane is not the source of reality. It is the scoreboard of deeper processes. Let that idea settle for a moment. A scoreboard does not determine the outcome of a game. It simply displays the result of what has already happened. The game itself unfolds somewhere else. On the field, in the strategy, in the decisions made moment by moment. Yet imagine someone staring at a scoreboard and trying to change the score directly. They might shout at it. They might complain about it. They might desperately wish for different numbers to appear. But nothing would change, because the scoreboard is not the cause. It is the reflection. The same pattern exists in life. The physical world reflects processes that began earlier, on the mental and spiritual planes. But because the physical world is what we can see, touch, and measure, most people mistakenly treat it as the starting point. They try to change results without examining the patterns producing those results. And this is where the feeling of heaviness begins. Imagine someone who believes success is always difficult. Not just challenging, but deeply exhausting. They may carry an internal story that says, "Nothing in life comes easily for me." That belief might not be obvious at first. It may exist quietly in the background of their thinking, but it begins shaping subtle decisions. They approach opportunities cautiously. They expect obstacles. They interpret setbacks as confirmation of their belief. Over time, the physical world begins reflecting that expectation. Their experiences seem to confirm that progress is always difficult. And the cycle continues. The physical plane becomes a mirror, not just reflecting actions, but reflecting the thoughts and identities guiding those actions. This is why two people can work equally hard and experience completely different results. The difference is rarely effort alone. It is the internal patterns directing that effort. One person approaches challenges with the expectation that solutions will appear. Another approaches the same challenge, expecting struggle. Their behavior changes in subtle ways. Confidence influences communication. Belief influences persistence. Expectation influences creativity. And these small differences gradually shape the physical outcomes they experience. Again and again, the physical world reflects what the mental world rehearses. This does not mean that the physical world is unimportant. Far from it. The physical plane is where life is experienced. It is where relationships unfold, where ideas become actions, where opportunities become tangible. But it is not where reality begins. Reality arrives there. And when people try to change their lives only through physical effort, they often find themselves pushing against invisible resistance, because the deeper patterns remain unchanged. Think about a time when you tried to force yourself into a new habit. Perhaps you decided to wake up earlier, or exercise consistently, or pursue a goal you had been postponing. At first, motivation was strong. You applied discipline. You pushed through resistance. For a few days, maybe even a few weeks, progress happened. But then something subtle began to appear. Fatigue. Excuses. A quiet voice saying, "Maybe tomorrow." The physical effort was there, but the internal alignment was missing. Your mind had not fully accepted the new pattern, and your identity had not fully embraced the new behavior. So the effort felt heavier than it needed to be. This is one of the great misunderstandings about personal change. People believe that transformation requires constant force, but the truth is slightly different. Lasting transformation happens when effort and alignment begin working together. Effort moves you forward. Alignment removes resistance. And alignment begins with awareness. Instead of immediately fighting circumstances, there is a more powerful question you can begin asking. A question that shifts your focus from the surface of reality to its deeper structure. The question is simple. What mental pattern produced this situation? Not in a way that blames yourself for everything, but in a way that invites curiosity. For example, if a recurring problem appears in your professional life, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what expectation do I carry into these situations? What assumptions might be shaping my decisions? What story about myself is influencing my behavior here? You may discover patterns that were previously invisible, patterns that quietly guided choices without your awareness. And the moment you begin noticing those patterns, something important happens. You move from reaction to understanding. You stop fighting the scoreboard. You begin examining the game itself. And once the deeper patterns become visible, they can be adjusted. Thought by thought, decision by decision, identity by identity. Gradually, the physical results begin shifting, not through force, but through alignment. This is why mastering the physical plane requires something deeper than physical effort. It requires awareness of the planes beneath it, because the physical world is only one layer of the system shaping your experience. When people rely on the physical plane alone, life feels heavy. Every improvement requires pushing harder than the last. But when the mental and spiritual planes begin working alongside it, effort becomes more effective, decisions become clearer, progress becomes more natural. And this realization leads us to the next discovery. If the physical world reflects deeper processes, then the most powerful place to influence your future is not the external environment. It is the world of thought, the mental plane, the place where interpretations form, where possibilities are evaluated, where decisions quietly take shape long before they appear in physical reality. You have now seen why the physical plane alone can feel so heavy. You've seen why chasing outcomes without understanding the patterns behind them leads to frustration. But the real power of change begins somewhere else entirely. You've examined the scoreboard. Now it's time to explore the field where the game is actually played. And that field exists inside the mind. You've seen how reality appears in the physical world. Now let's explore where it is truly shaped. Chapter 3. The Mental Plane, where your future is actually built. Imagine two people standing in the same room. They are presented with the same opportunity, the same invitation, the same possibility. Perhaps it is a chance to lead a project. Perhaps it is the chance to start something new. Perhaps it is a moment that could change the direction of their lives. On the surface, everything about the situation appears identical. The same environment, the same timing, the same potential reward. But something fascinating begins to unfold. One person pauses. Their mind immediately begins evaluating risks. Questions appear. What if I'm not ready? What if I fail? What if someone more qualified should do this instead? Within seconds, hesitation forms. Their body language changes. Their voice becomes cautious. And eventually they step back. The opportunity quietly moves past them. Now look at the second person. They receive the same invitation. They hear the same information. But their internal reaction is different. Instead of hesitation, curiosity appears. Their mind begins asking a different set of questions. How could I make this work? What would I need to learn? What might happen if I try? Their posture shifts slightly forward. Their tone carries a sense of possibility. And before long, they say yes. Same opportunity. Two completely different outcomes. So the question becomes unavoidable. What created the difference? It wasn't the physical environment. It wasn't the opportunity itself. The difference existed somewhere deeper. It existed on the mental plane. The mental plane is the world of interpretation. It is the place where events are given meaning, where possibilities are evaluated, where decisions quietly begin forming long before they turn into actions. Every experience that enters your life must first pass through this mental layer. And as it passes through, something remarkable happens. Your mind interprets what it sees. not just logically, but emotionally, automatically, and most importantly, according to patterns it has practiced before. These patterns act like filters. They shape how situations are understood. They determine whether something feels exciting or intimidating, possible or unrealistic, aligned or uncomfortable. And here is where a powerful realization begins to emerge. The mind does not act according to possibility. It acts according to identity. Let that phrase settle into your awareness. The mind does not act according to possibility. It acts according to identity, because possibility is infinite. Every day, the world presents opportunities that could change someone's life. But identity determines which of those possibilities feel believable. Identity quietly defines what feels natural, what feels acceptable, what feels within reach. And your mind organizes its decisions around those invisible boundaries. This is why two people can observe the exact same opportunity and experience completely different reactions. One person's identity says, "This is the kind of thing people like me can do." The other person's identity says, "This is probably meant for someone else." The opportunity itself hasn't changed, but the interpretation has. And interpretation shapes action. Action shapes outcomes. And outcomes shape the physical world we eventually experience. When you begin to observe the mental plane closely, you start noticing how powerful these filters truly are. Consider how many thoughts pass through your mind in a single day. Ideas, doubts, possibilities, concerns, encouragements, warnings. Most of them appear automatically. You do not consciously design every thought that enters your mind. Yet those thoughts influence behavior constantly. A small moment of doubt can stop an action before it begins. A quiet spark of belief can create movement where hesitation once lived. And because these mental reactions happen quickly, they often feel like simple instincts. But they are rarely random. They are the result of patterns your mind has rehearsed repeatedly over time. Patterns form through experience, through past successes and failures, through stories you absorbed growing up, through the identities you gradually adopted. Your mind becomes very good at protecting those identities. It builds mental pathways designed to keep your actions consistent with the person it believes you are. If your identity says you are cautious, the mind will generate thoughts that encourage caution. If your identity says you are capable, the mind will produce thoughts that encourage action. The mind's primary goal is not perfect logic. Its goal is internal consistency, and that consistency is built around identity. This is why people sometimes struggle to act on opportunities they clearly understand. Logically, they may know something is possible, but emotionally, their identity has not accepted it yet. And when identity and logic disagree, identity usually wins, because identity operates deeper within the system. It influences which thoughts feel convincing, which interpretations feel believable, which actions feel comfortable enough to pursue. Once you see this process clearly, many moments from your past begin making more sense. Think about a time when you hesitated before doing something that later seemed obvious. At the time, your mind may have produced convincing reasons to wait, reasons that felt rational. But looking back, you realize something different. The hesitation wasn't really about the opportunity. It was about whether that opportunity matched the identity you held at that moment. And the same pattern appears in positive moments as well. There may have been times when you surprised yourself, moments when you acted more boldly than expected, moments when confidence appeared almost unexpectedly. What changed? Often, something had shifted internally. Your identity had expanded slightly. And once identity expanded, your mind began generating a different set of thoughts. Thoughts that encouraged movement instead of hesitation. Thoughts that allowed possibility to feel natural. This is why the mental plane plays such an important role in shaping your future. Because the future is not only created through external effort, It is created through internal interpretation. The thoughts you rehearse today become the actions you take tomorrow. The interpretations you accept today become the decisions that shape your direction. And slowly, consistently, those decisions build the life you eventually experience. Pause for a moment and reflect on something personal. Think about a recurring pattern in your life. Perhaps it appears in your work. Perhaps it appears in relationships. Perhaps it appears in the way you approach new challenges. Is there a type of situation where your response tends to follow a familiar script? Maybe hesitation appears. Maybe overthinking appears. Maybe self-doubt quietly enters the conversation. Or perhaps the pattern is positive. Maybe you consistently step forward in certain environments. Maybe you adapt quickly when challenges arise. Maybe you instinctively search for solutions. Whatever the pattern may be, it is not accidental. It is the result of mental filters that have been practiced over time. Filters shaped by identity. And the moment you begin noticing those patterns, something powerful happens. You gain distance from them. Instead of automatically believing every thought your mind produces, you begin observing those thoughts. You begin asking quiet questions. Why does this situation trigger hesitation? Why does this opportunity feel unfamiliar? Why does this challenge produce confidence instead of fear? Awareness interrupts automatic behavior. And once awareness appears, the mental plane becomes something you can influence. You begin realizing that thoughts are not permanent commands. They are interpretations. Interpretations that can evolve. Interpretations that can expand as identity expands. This is where real change begins. Not by forcing the mind to ignore fear. Not by pretending uncertainty doesn't exist. But by gradually introducing new interpretations. New perspectives. New stories about what is possible for someone like you. Because the mind learns through repetition. What you rehearse mentally begins to feel natural. What feels natural eventually becomes action. And action shapes the physical world around you. Again and again, the same principle quietly appears. The physical world reflects what the mental world rehearses. But the mental world itself is guided by something deeper still. Something even more foundational than thought. Identity. Because the mind does not act according to possibility. It acts according to identity. And that realization leads us to the next layer of this exploration. You've now seen how the mental plane interprets reality and guides behavior. But there is a deeper question waiting beneath the surface. Where does identity come from? What determines the internal story that your mind works so hard to protect? To answer that question, we must step into the deepest plane of all, the spiritual plane, the place where meaning, purpose, and identity quietly take shape. You've explored the world of thought. Now it's time to explore the source of the thinker. Chapter 4. The Spiritual Plane, the Quiet Source of Direction. By now, you have seen how the physical plane displays outcomes. You have seen how the mental plane interprets situations and shapes decisions. But beneath both of those layers, there is something deeper, something quieter, something that influences your thoughts long before you become aware of them. This is the spiritual plane. And before we explore it further, it is important to clarify something. When many people hear the word spiritual, their mind immediately connects it to religion. They imagine rituals, beliefs, traditions, or philosophical systems. But the spiritual plane we are discussing here is not about religion. It is about identity. It is the deepest layer of how you experience yourself, the internal sense of who you are, the story you carry about your role in the world, the meaning you attach to your existence, and the direction you feel pulled toward, even when you cannot fully explain why. This layer of identity operates quietly, often invisibly, yet it is constantly shaping how your mind behaves. Because your mind is not an independent machine. Your mind works in service of your identity. The mind generates thoughts that protect and reinforce the person it believes you are, which means the deeper your identity sits within the system, the more influence it has over everything above it. Identity shapes thought. Thought shapes action. Action shapes physical reality. This is why two people with similar intelligence, similar opportunities, and similar environments can move through life in completely different ways. Because the identities guiding them are different. One person might quietly believe, "I am someone who learns quickly and adapts." Another person might carry a different identity. "I tend to struggle when things become complicated." Neither of these identities may have been consciously chosen. They may have formed gradually over years of experience. But once they take root, they begin directing the entire system. The mind produces thoughts that reinforce the identity. Behavior follows the thoughts. And the physical world eventually reflects the behavior. This is why identity is so powerful. It operates beneath awareness most of the time, but it quietly organizes your life. Consider how often people attempt to change their behavior. They decide they want to become more disciplined, more confident, more productive. So they begin forcing themselves to behave differently. They wake up earlier. They create strict routines. They push themselves into new habits. And for a while, progress appears. But then something subtle begins to happen. The new behavior starts to feel unnatural. It requires constant effort. Motivation fades. The old patterns slowly return. And people often assume the problem was a lack of discipline. But the real issue exists deeper in the system. The identity guiding the mind never changed. The person attempted to install new behaviors on top of an old identity. And the mind quietly pulled them back toward the familiar. Because the mind is designed to protect identity. This is one of the most important psychological patterns you can recognize. Most people attempt to change behavior without updating identity. They focus on the surface of the system, but the deeper layer remains untouched. And when the deeper layer remains unchanged, the system eventually returns to its previous state. But something extraordinary happens when identity begins to shift. When identity changes, behavior reorganizes automatically. Let that idea settle in your mind. When identity changes, behavior reorganizes automatically. Because the mind suddenly begins producing a different set of thoughts. Thoughts that match the new identity. Imagine someone who begins seeing themselves as a learner rather than someone who struggles with challenges. The next time they encounter something difficult, their internal dialogue changes. Instead of thinking, "I'm not good at this," the thought becomes, "This is something I can figure out." The situation hasn't changed, but the interpretation has. And the interpretation changes the action that follows. This is how identity quietly directs the mental plane. And through the mental plane, it directs the physical world. Think about the identities people carry without even realizing it. I'm someone who always finishes what I start. I'm someone who avoids confrontation. I'm someone who needs stability. I'm someone who thrives in uncertainty. Each of these identities shapes the decisions a person will make. Not because they consciously force those decisions, but because the mind organizes behavior around identity automatically. You do not need to convince someone to act in alignment with who they believe they are. They will do it naturally. And this leads to a fascinating realization. Much of the effort people spend trying to improve their lives is actually misdirected. They try to force actions instead of expanding identity. But identity is the true source of direction. It is the compass beneath your thoughts, the invisible framework shaping how your mind interprets the world. And when identity expands, the entire system reorganizes itself. New thoughts appear. New behaviors emerge. New possibilities feel natural. It is not forced. It is aligned. This is why the spiritual plane is so important. Because it is the place where meaning and identity meet. It is where you quietly decide the kind of person you are becoming. not through loud declarations, but through the subtle beliefs you accept about yourself. The spiritual plane answers questions that shape your entire direction. Questions like, who am I becoming? What kind of thinker do I want to be? What type of challenges do I believe I can handle? What kind of life aligns with the person I see myself as? These questions rarely appear in everyday conversations, but they are constantly influencing behavior. And once you become aware of them, something remarkable happens. You begin realizing that identity is not fixed. It is shaped, gradually, deliberately, moment by moment, each time you choose a thought, each time you interpret a challenge, each time you decide how to respond to an opportunity. You are quietly reinforcing an identity, or expanding it, and the identity you reinforce eventually becomes the one your mind defends. Which means your future is not just determined by what you do. It is determined by who you believe you are becoming. This realization brings us back to the central theme of this journey, the three planes of existence. The physical plane displays results. The mental plane interprets experience. But the spiritual plane provides direction. Without direction, the mental plane becomes scattered. Without alignment, the physical plane becomes exhausting. But when identity, thought, and action begin working together, life becomes coherent, effort becomes meaningful, and progress becomes sustainable. The spiritual plane anchors the entire system. It ensures that the mind generates thoughts aligned with the person you are becoming, and those thoughts guide actions that shape your physical reality. This is the quiet architecture of transformation. Not force, alignment, not endless discipline, identity. Because when identity changes, behavior reorganizes automatically. And once you begin understanding the role of the spiritual plane, you start seeing something else. Most people do not fail because they lack intelligence or effort. They struggle because the three planes of their existence are disconnected. Identity pulls one direction, thought pulls another, action pulls somewhere else entirely. And that internal misalignment creates friction, confusion, exhaustion. But when the three planes begin aligning, clarity appears, energy increases, momentum builds. You begin living as a coherent system rather than a collection of scattered efforts. And that leads to the next discovery. Because even after understanding the three planes, many people still fall into a subtle trap. A trap that keeps them stuck despite their best intentions. They attempt to live on only one plane at a time. They chase physical outcomes, or they analyze endlessly on the mental plane, or they reflect deeply without taking action. Each approach contains value, but none of them work in isolation. The real power appears when the planes operate together. And understanding the dangers of imbalance reveals why so many people feel stuck despite their effort. You now understand the deepest layer of direction. But the next step is learning why imbalance between these planes creates so much struggle. You've discovered the compass. Now it's time to understand why most people lose their way. Chapter 5. The dangerous illusion of living on one plane. There is a subtle illusion that quietly shapes the lives of millions of people. It is not obvious at first. In fact, most people live inside this illusion for years without ever noticing it. They work hard. They think deeply. They search for meaning. And yet, something still feels out of balance. Progress appears for a while, then disappears. Motivation rises, then fades. Clarity arrives, then slowly dissolves back into confusion. The person begins to wonder why life feels so inconsistent, why momentum is difficult to maintain, why effort does not always produce the transformation they expected. And the reason often comes down to something surprisingly simple. Most people live on only one plane of existence. They unknowingly place all their energy into one level of the system while ignoring the others. And because the three planes of existence are designed to work together, imbalance creates friction. To understand this more clearly, Imagine looking at three different types of people. Each one is working hard to improve their life. Each one believes they are doing the right things. But each one is operating almost entirely on a single plane. The first person lives almost entirely on the physical plane. This person believes that effort is the solution to everything. They wake up early. They work long hours. They push themselves to keep going even when they are exhausted. Their philosophy is simple. If something is not working, work harder. If progress slows, increase effort. If results are not appearing, double the discipline. At first, this approach seems admirable. After all, discipline and effort are powerful tools. But something slowly begins to happen. Despite all the effort, the same types of obstacles continue appearing. They change jobs but encounter similar frustrations. They pursue new goals but face familiar doubts. They push forward relentlessly, yet life still feels heavy. Because effort alone cannot overcome misalignment. When the physical plane is working harder than the mental and spiritual planes, life becomes a constant uphill climb. The person may achieve progress, but it requires enormous energy. Now imagine the second type of person. This person lives primarily on the mental plane. They think deeply. They analyze everything. They read books. They study ideas. They explore different perspectives about success, psychology, and personal growth. Their mind is full of insight. They understand concepts that many people never encounter. But something strange begins to appear here as well. Despite all the thinking, their physical world does not change very much. Ideas remain ideas. Plans remain plans. Possibilities remain possibilities. Because thought without action cannot produce physical results. The mental plane can design incredible futures. But if those ideas never move into the physical world, they remain unrealized potential. The person becomes trapped in a cycle of reflection, always learning, always analyzing, but rarely moving. And then there is the third type of person. This individual spends most of their energy exploring the spiritual plane. They think about purpose. They reflect on identity. They ask deep questions about meaning and direction. They may feel deeply connected to ideas about growth, awareness, and personal evolution. But even here, imbalance can appear. If identity reflection is not connected to thought and action, it becomes abstract. A person may understand themselves deeply, yet still struggle to create change in their physical life. Because insight alone is not transformation. Insight must move through the mental plane and eventually become action. When we observe these three patterns, something becomes very clear. Each plane contains power, but none of them work effectively in isolation. The physical plane without the mental plane creates exhaustion. The mental plane without the physical plane creates stagnation. The spiritual plane without the other two creates detachment. Real transformation requires something different. It requires alignment. The three planes must work together. Identity shapes thought. Thought guides action. Action produces results. When this sequence flows naturally, life begins to feel different. Effort becomes focused instead of scattered. Decisions feel clearer. Momentum begins to build. And the strange heaviness that once accompanied progress begins to disappear. Because the system is finally working as it was designed. But there is an even deeper layer to this imbalance. A force that quietly pulls people back toward the familiar, even when they begin trying to align the three planes. This force creates invisible resistance, a type of internal tension. And understanding it reveals why transformation often feels uncomfortable at first. This force is called identity friction. Identity friction appears whenever a person attempts to behave in ways that conflict with their current identity. It is the internal resistance that arises when the mind senses change approaching. For example, imagine someone who has always thought of themselves as cautious. Suddenly they decide to pursue a bold opportunity. Their mental plane may understand the logic. Their physical plane may even begin taking action. But their identity has not yet adjusted, and that creates friction. The mind begins producing thoughts designed to restore the old identity. Maybe this is too risky. Maybe I should wait. Maybe this isn't the right time. These thoughts are not random. They are attempts to restore internal stability, because identity prefers familiarity, even if that familiarity limits growth. This is why many people experience resistance at the exact moment they attempt to expand their life. Not because the opportunity is wrong, but because their identity is adjusting. The system is recalibrating, and during that recalibration, friction appears. Understanding this changes how you interpret resistance. Instead of seeing resistance as a sign that something is wrong, you begin recognizing it as a signal that something is shifting. The three planes are beginning to reorganize. Identity is expanding. Thought is adapting. Action is moving into new territory. And friction is simply the temporary tension created by growth. This realization is incredibly important, because without it, people often retreat the moment discomfort appears. They assume the difficulty means they should stop. But often, that discomfort is simply the mind adjusting to a larger identity. And once the adjustment is complete, the new behavior begins to feel natural. This is the path of alignment. Identity evolves. Thought adapts. Action follows. And slowly, consistently, the three planes begin working together. Life stops feeling like three competing forces. It begins feeling like one coherent movement forward. But to reach that point, you must first recognize the illusion that has kept so many people stuck. The illusion that effort alone is enough. The illusion that thinking alone is enough. The illusion that reflection alone is enough. Each plane has power, but only alignment creates transformation. When identity, thought, and action begin working together, the entire experience of reality shifts. You move from reacting to life to designing it, and that leads us directly into the next discovery. Because once someone understands the three planes and begins aligning them, a new challenge appears. A deeper barrier, a subtle psychological defense mechanism that prevents many people from stepping fully into the life they desire. It is not a lack of opportunity. It is not a lack of intelligence. It is not even a lack of effort. It is something much quieter. The identity barrier. The invisible limit people carry about who they believe they are allowed to become. You've now seen why living on one plane creates imbalance. You've seen why alignment is necessary for transformation. But the next step reveals the hidden barrier that prevents many people from expanding their identity in the first place. You've seen the illusion of imbalance. Now it's time to uncover the boundary most people never realize they are protecting. Chapter 6: The Identity Barrier That Holds Most People Back. There is a moment that appears quietly in many people's lives. A moment that seems small at first. An opportunity arrives. A door opens. A possibility presents itself that could change the direction of everything. And for a brief moment, excitement appears. You imagine what life could look like if you stepped forward. You picture the new direction, the new environment, the new version of yourself that might emerge if you accepted the challenge. But then something else appears. A quiet hesitation, a subtle tension that seems to slow everything down. Your mind begins generating questions. Am I really ready for this? What if I'm not the right person for this opportunity? What if people expect more from me than I can deliver? And before long, the opportunity quietly fades away. Not because it was impossible, not because it lacked potential, but because something deeper inside the system intervened. This moment happens more often than people realize. And when it repeats enough times, many individuals begin to draw the wrong conclusion. They assume they missed the opportunity because they lacked confidence, or motivation, or preparation. But the real reason usually exists deeper than that. It exists in the identity barrier. The identity barrier is one of the most powerful invisible forces shaping human behavior. It is the boundary your mind creates around the person it believes you are. Inside that boundary, actions feel natural. Outside that boundary, actions feel uncomfortable, even if they could improve your life. And because the mind prefers internal consistency, it often prevents behavior that conflicts with identity. This means something fascinating begins to happen when new opportunities appear. Your logical mind might see the potential, but your identity silently asks a different question. Is this something a person like me would do? If the answer feels like yes, action flows naturally. If the answer feels uncertain, hesitation appears. And if the answer feels like no, the mind begins producing reasons to avoid the opportunity altogether. These reasons can sound logical. They can sound responsible. They can sound thoughtful. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. The identity barrier is protecting the familiar. Think about how often people describe themselves with simple statements. I'm not the kind of person who takes big risks. I've always been more comfortable staying behind the scenes. I'm not naturally confident in those situations. At first glance, these statements feel harmless. They feel like simple descriptions of personality. But over time, they become something more powerful. They become identity anchors. And the mind begins organizing behavior around them. Once a statement becomes part of identity, the brain starts defending it. This defense happens automatically, not because the brain wants to limit you, but because the brain values stability. The mind is designed to maintain consistency between identity and behavior. It wants the person you believe you are to match the actions you take. And when those two elements align, life feels stable, predictable, familiar. But when behavior threatens to expand beyond identity, the brain senses instability, and instability triggers resistance. This resistance does not appear as a loud warning. It appears quietly, through hesitation, through doubt, through subtle emotional discomfort. Imagine someone who has always thought of themselves as quiet and reserved. Now imagine they are suddenly asked to lead an important presentation. Their logical mind may recognize the opportunity. They may even know they are capable of doing it well. But their identity sends a different signal. This is not who I am. And once that signal appears, the mental plane begins generating thoughts that support it. Someone else would probably do this better. I'm not sure I'm the best choice. Maybe I should wait until I feel more ready. What is happening here is not a lack of ability. It is identity friction. The brain is attempting to preserve the familiar identity, even if that identity limits growth. This is one of the most surprising psychological truths about human behavior. The brain protects familiar identity, even if that identity limits success. Because success is not the brain's primary goal. Stability is. Familiarity is. Predictability is. The mind would rather maintain a predictable identity than risk stepping into an unfamiliar one. And this explains something that confuses many people. Why do individuals sometimes sabotage opportunities they genuinely want? Why do they delay taking action on goals that matter deeply to them? Why do they step back just as progress begins appearing? The answer often lies within the identity barrier. If the new opportunity requires becoming a different type of person, the mind may resist it. Not consciously, but automatically. It quietly produces thoughts that guide behavior back toward the familiar. This process happens so quickly that most people never notice it. They simply assume their hesitation reflects reality. But once you begin observing this pattern, something remarkable happens. You start noticing the moments when identity is influencing your decisions. You notice the small voice that says, "This isn't really who I am." You notice the subtle tension that appears when life invites you to expand. And suddenly, those moments become opportunities. Because awareness weakens the barrier. The moment you see the identity pattern, you gain the ability to question it. Instead of accepting the identity as fixed, you begin exploring it as something flexible, something evolving, something that can grow alongside your experiences. And that leads us to one of the most powerful questions you can ask yourself. A question that creates a powerful wake-up moment in the mind. Pause for a moment and consider this carefully. What identity have you been protecting without realizing it? Take a moment to let that question settle. What identity have you been protecting without realizing it? Perhaps it is the identity of being cautious. Perhaps it is the identity of being the responsible one. Perhaps it is the identity of being someone who avoids risk. Perhaps it is even the identity of being someone who struggles. Whatever the identity may be, it has likely shaped thousands of decisions over the years. Not loudly, but quietly, guiding behavior through subtle mental filters. But here is the realization that begins transforming everything. Identity is not permanent. Identity is practiced. It is built through repetition, through interpretation, through the stories you reinforce about who you are. And because identity is practiced, it can also be expanded. New experiences introduce new interpretations. New interpretations introduce new behaviors. New behaviors slowly build new identity. The identity barrier begins shifting the moment you stop treating it as a fixed boundary. Instead of asking, "Is this who I am?" you begin asking a more powerful question. Is this who I am becoming? That simple shift changes everything. Because identity becomes a direction rather than a limitation, a process rather than a label. And when identity becomes flexible, the three planes of existence begin aligning more naturally. Your spiritual plane expands. Your mental plane generates new thoughts. Your physical plane begins producing different results. The barrier that once limited possibility becomes a doorway to growth. But even after people recognize the identity barrier, another challenge still appears. A subtle resistance that continues showing up in the mind. Even when identity begins expanding. Even when opportunities feel aligned. Even when logic clearly supports taking action. The mind still finds ways to hesitate, because the brain has another protective mechanism, one that influences thoughts long before identity consciously changes. You've seen how identity creates invisible limits, but the next discovery reveals why the mind itself sometimes resists the life you say you want. You've uncovered the identity barrier. Now it's time to understand the deeper mechanism behind that resistance. Chapter 7. Why Your Mind Resists the Life You Want. There is a strange moment that appears just before many people experience a breakthrough. At first, everything seems to be moving in the right direction. Progress begins to appear. Momentum slowly builds. You feel as if something new is beginning to take shape in your life. The opportunity is real. The path forward is visible. And yet, something unexpected begins to happen. Instead of accelerating forward, hesitation appears. Doubt begins whispering in the background. You start questioning things that seemed clear only moments before. Suddenly, the mind begins asking questions like, "Is this really the right time? Maybe I should slow down. What if I'm moving too fast?" And before long, the energy that was building begins to dissolve. The breakthrough that once felt close slowly drifts away. This pattern confuses many people, because logically it makes no sense. If someone wants success, why would they resist it? If someone wants growth, why would they hesitate when growth begins appearing? If someone desires change, why would they sabotage the moment change becomes possible? The answer reveals one of the most counterintuitive truths about the human mind. Your brain does not prioritize success. Your brain prioritizes predictability. Predictability feels safe. Predictability feels familiar. Predictability feels manageable. And because the brain evolved to protect survival, it tends to prefer situations it already understands, even if those situations are imperfect. This leads to a fascinating and often invisible behavior pattern. The brain often prefers predictable problems over unfamiliar success. Think about that idea for a moment. Predictable problems over unfamiliar success. At first, that idea sounds almost absurd. Why would anyone choose problems over success? But if you look closely at human behavior, you begin to see this pattern everywhere. Some people remain in careers they dislike for years, even when they have the ability to pursue something better. Some people remain in environments that limit their growth, even when opportunities exist elsewhere. Some people repeatedly return to patterns they know are unhealthy, simply because those patterns feel familiar. This does not happen because people enjoy suffering. It happens because the brain understands the structure of the familiar. It knows how to navigate it, even if the situation contains challenges, even if the situation contains stress, even if the situation limits potential. Familiar problems still feel predictable. Unfamiliar success, on the other hand, introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty activates the brain's protective instincts. When success begins appearing, new expectations arrive, new responsibilities emerge, new environments may appear, new social dynamics begin forming, and most importantly, a new identity begins taking shape. But as we explored in the previous chapter, identity stability is something the brain protects carefully. The moment life begins moving in a direction that challenges your familiar identity, the mind begins evaluating the situation, not through the lens of potential, but through the lens of safety. And that is where resistance begins forming. Imagine someone who has spent years thinking of themselves as someone who struggles financially, not by choice, but simply through repeated experiences. Over time, that identity becomes familiar. The person learns how to manage their situation. They learn how to explain it to others. They learn how to navigate the emotional patterns surrounding it. Then one day, something changes. A business opportunity appears. A new career path opens. Income begins increasing. Logically, this should feel like progress. But internally, something strange may occur. Instead of pure excitement, subtle tension appears. Questions begin forming. What if I lose it? What if I can't maintain this? What if people expect more from me now? These thoughts are not random. They are signals from a brain attempting to protect identity stability. Because success introduces unfamiliar territory. It requires new behaviors, new decisions, new ways of thinking. And until those patterns become familiar, the brain often interprets them as uncertain. This is why many breakthroughs come with hesitation. People feel the opportunity. They recognize the potential. But their mind begins pulling them gently back toward what it already understands. Back toward the familiar identity. Back toward the predictable environment. Back toward the life the brain has already mapped. This process can create a powerful internal loop, a reinforcement cycle that quietly shapes behavior over time. The cycle often begins with identity. Your mind forms beliefs about who you are. Those beliefs influence the decisions you make. Those decisions create results. Those results then reinforce the original identity. And the cycle repeats. If someone believes they are not naturally confident, they may avoid situations that require visible leadership. Because they avoid those situations, they never gain the experiences that build confidence. Because those experiences never occur, the original belief remains intact. And the mind quietly says, "See, this is who you are." The brain then defends that identity, not because it is accurate, but because it is familiar. And the reinforcement loop continues. Your mind defends who it believes you are. This sentence may seem simple, but its implications are profound. Because it means the greatest resistance you experience in life may not come from the outside world. It may come from the internal system designed to protect the identity you've practiced for years. This realization can feel unsettling at first, because it suggests that the mind itself can become a barrier. But there is also something incredibly empowering about this discovery. Once you recognize the pattern, you can begin interrupting it. You can begin noticing the moments when resistance appears, not as a sign that something is wrong, but as a signal that something new is emerging. Instead of interpreting hesitation as a warning, you begin interpreting it as a threshold between the familiar self and the expanding self. When you approach growth, the mind will often try to pull you backward. But that pull is not a command. It is simply a habit, a familiar pattern repeating itself. And habits can be changed. When you recognize resistance for what it is, you begin responding differently. Instead of retreating from opportunity, you pause and observe the reaction. You notice the thoughts. You notice the tension. You notice the familiar narratives the mind begins producing. And instead of obeying those narratives automatically, you question them. You ask a new question. What if this resistance is not a warning, but a sign that I'm moving beyond the identity my mind has practiced for years? That single question begins shifting your relationship with resistance. The hesitation that once stopped you now becomes information, a signal that growth is occurring, a signal that identity is expanding, a signal that your mind is adjusting to unfamiliar territory. Over time, something remarkable begins happening. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. New actions become normal. New environments become comfortable. New levels of success begin feeling natural. The brain slowly updates its internal map. What once felt uncertain begins feeling predictable. What once felt risky begins feeling routine. And the identity barrier expands again. But understanding resistance is only the beginning, because there is another discovery waiting just beyond it. A discovery that explains why some individuals transform their lives once they understand these patterns, while others remain stuck even after learning them. The difference lies in something deeper than knowledge. It lies in a shift that occurs at the level of identity itself. You've seen how the mind protects familiar identity. You've seen how it resists unfamiliar success. Now the question becomes even more important. If identity shapes behavior, how does identity actually change? Because once identity changes, everything else begins to follow. The thoughts shift. The decisions shift. The actions shift. The life itself begins moving in a different direction. You've uncovered why your mind resists the life you want. Now it's time to explore the moment when identity begins rewriting itself. And when that moment happens, the entire trajectory of a life can change. Chapter 8. The moment you take back control of reality. There is a moment in every real transformation that most people never notice. It does not look dramatic. It does not arrive with applause. There is no sudden lightning bolt of motivation. Instead, it begins quietly, almost invisibly. A small shift occurs inside the mind. A shift so subtle that if you were not paying attention, you might miss it entirely. But once this shift happens, something powerful begins unfolding. Because this moment marks the point where you stop being unconsciously directed by your patterns and begin consciously observing them. And the moment you observe a pattern, you gain the power to change it. For most of life, human behavior operates on autopilot. Not because people lack intelligence, not because they lack discipline, but because the brain is designed to conserve energy. Instead of analyzing every situation from scratch, the mind relies on familiar patterns. Thought patterns, emotional patterns, behavioral patterns, identity patterns. These patterns are useful. They allow you to function quickly, to react efficiently, to navigate the world without constantly overthinking every decision. But there is a hidden cost to this efficiency. Because once patterns become automatic, they begin operating beneath your awareness. You stop noticing them. You stop questioning them. You simply experience the results they produce. Imagine someone who has spent years believing they are not good at taking risks. That belief eventually becomes part of their identity. From that point forward, the brain quietly filters opportunities through that identity. If an opportunity appears that requires risk, hesitation appears automatically, not after careful analysis, but instantly. The person might interpret that hesitation as intuition, or logic, or common sense, but often it is simply a pattern repeating itself, a subconscious identity guiding behavior. This is why many people feel as though life is happening to them. They experience recurring results, recurring frustrations, recurring limitations, but they cannot quite identify the invisible system producing those outcomes. Until one day, something changes. A moment of awareness appears. You catch a thought in real time. Perhaps it happens in a situation where you normally would have reacted automatically. Maybe someone challenges you. Maybe an opportunity appears. Maybe you feel that familiar hesitation beginning to rise. But instead of immediately obeying the thought that appears, you notice it. You hear the internal voice. I'm not the type of person who does this. And for the first time, you pause. That pause may last only a few seconds, but it changes everything. Because in that moment, something extraordinary occurs. You step outside the automatic system. Instead of being controlled by the thought, you observe the thought. And that observation creates distance. Distance between you and the pattern. Distance between awareness and identity. Distance between the present moment and the past conditioning that shaped it. This is the true transformation point. Not when circumstances change, not when motivation spikes, but when awareness interrupts autopilot. Awareness breaks subconscious patterns. When a pattern is unconscious, it runs freely. But when a pattern becomes visible, it becomes optional. And this realization introduces one of the most powerful personal coaching strategies ever discovered. It is simple, but it is not always easy. The strategy has 3 steps. Pause. Observe. Question. First, pause. When you feel a familiar emotional reaction beginning to rise, pause. When hesitation appears before a new opportunity, pause. When self-doubt whispers something familiar, pause. That pause interrupts the automatic loop. Without the pause, the pattern runs uninterrupted. With the pause, awareness enters the system. Second, observe. Look at the thoughts that appear. Listen to the internal dialogue that begins forming. Notice the assumptions your mind quietly introduces. You might hear thoughts like, "This isn't something people like me do. I'm probably not ready yet. I should stay where things feel safe." Instead of arguing with these thoughts immediately, simply observe them. Notice their tone. Notice their familiarity. Notice how often you have heard them before. You begin realizing something surprising. Many of the thoughts that feel personal are actually repetitive. They are old scripts playing again and again. Scripts that once served a purpose, but scripts that may no longer reflect who you are becoming. Then comes the third step. Question. Question the identity assumptions hidden inside the thought. Instead of asking, "Is this thought correct?" ask a different question. What identity is this thought trying to protect? Maybe the thought is protecting the identity of being cautious. Maybe it is protecting the identity of avoiding visibility. Maybe it is protecting the identity of someone who plays small. But the moment you see the identity behind the thought, something remarkable happens. The thought loses its authority, because you realize it is not a universal truth. It is simply a reflection of a past identity. And identities can evolve. They are not fixed. They are practiced. They are reinforced through repetition, which means they can also be upgraded through repetition. This realization leads us to an idea that quietly transforms how people relate to their thoughts. An idea so simple that it can be repeated like a mantra whenever identity resistance appears. The moment you question an identity, you loosen its control. Let that sentence settle for a moment. The moment you question an identity, you loosen its control. Not destroy it instantly. Not eliminate it overnight. But loosen it. Identity is like a tightly wound not formed over years of repeated reinforcement. You do not untie it in a single motion. But every time you question the assumption, the knot loosens slightly. Every time you pause instead of reacting automatically, the pattern weakens. Every time you choose a new action that contradicts the old identity, the brain begins updating its internal map. And slowly, the identity begins shifting. At first, the changes feel subtle. You respond differently in one conversation. You take one opportunity you might have avoided before. You speak up once when you normally would have remained silent. But these small actions carry enormous psychological impact. Because each new behavior sends a signal to the brain. A signal that says, the identity may be changing. The brain then begins updating its predictions about who you are. This process forms what we can call the identity upgrade loop. First, awareness reveals a limiting identity. Then questioning loosens its authority. Then new actions begin appearing. Those new actions create new evidence. That evidence gradually forms a new identity. And the cycle continues. Awareness, questioning, action, reinforcement. With each repetition, the upgraded identity becomes more natural, more stable, more believable, until one day you realize something surprising. The actions that once felt uncomfortable now feel normal. The opportunities that once triggered hesitation now feel exciting. The version of yourself that once felt distant now feels familiar. This is the moment when people begin feeling as though they have taken back control of their reality. Not because they control every circumstance, but because they now understand the internal system shaping their responses. They are no longer reacting unconsciously to the past. They are consciously shaping the identity that guides their future. And when identity shifts, reality begins shifting alongside it. Because identity determines perception. Perception influences decisions. Decisions create outcomes. And outcomes shape the life you experience. But even after someone learns to pause, observe, and question their patterns, another powerful discovery still awaits. A discovery that changes how people understand personal growth itself. Because many individuals believe transformation requires dramatic effort, radical change, massive leaps forward. But the truth is often much quieter, much simpler, and far more powerful. You've seen how awareness breaks subconscious patterns. You've discovered the moment when identity begins loosening its control. Now it's time to understand the small, consistent force that turns awareness into lasting transformation. Because the life you experience tomorrow is not created in dramatic moments. It is created in the quiet decisions you repeat every single day. You've taken back awareness of your identity. Now let's explore the invisible habits that quietly build the future version of you. Chapter 9. Designing a life that operates on all three levels. Most people spend years trying to fix the visible parts of their lives. They focus on changing habits. They attempt to become more disciplined. They set goals, create plans, and push themselves to take action. And sometimes those efforts work, for a while. But eventually something strange happens. Momentum fades. Old behaviors return. Motivation disappears just as quickly as it arrived. And people begin wondering why change feels so temporary. The answer often lies in something deeper than behavior. Because behavior is the surface layer of a much larger system. The real engine of transformation operates across three levels: the identity level, the mental level, and the physical level. These three levels quietly shape every action you take and every result you experience. When they operate in conflict, life feels like a constant struggle. But when they operate in alignment, progress begins to feel natural. Effort still exists, but the effort feels directed instead of exhausting. This chapter is about understanding how to design a life that functions on all three levels at once. Not randomly, not accidentally, but intentionally. To begin understanding this framework, imagine the three levels as layers of a structure. At the top sits the physical level. This is the level people see. Your actions, your routines, your habits, your visible decisions. This is the level most people try to change first. They attempt to wake up earlier, exercise more often, focus harder, work longer, improve their productivity. All of these changes happen at the physical level. But beneath that level lies the mental layer. This is where interpretation occurs, where thoughts form, where meaning is assigned to experiences, where beliefs quietly guide attention. Two people can experience the exact same situation and interpret it completely differently. One person sees opportunity. Another sees risk. One person sees growth. Another sees pressure. These interpretations are created at the mental level, and they influence whether physical action feels natural or forced. But beneath both of these layers lies the deepest level of all, the identity level. Identity answers a single powerful question. Who am I? Not who you wish to be, not who you hope to become, but who you believe you are right now. This belief influences everything above it. Your identity shapes the thoughts that feel believable. Those thoughts influence the actions that feel natural. And those actions produce the results you experience. This means the three levels operate in a powerful sequence. Identity influences thinking. Thinking influences action. Action produces outcomes. If one level is misaligned with the others, tension appears. Imagine someone who takes physical actions that contradict their identity. They might force themselves into behaviors that feel unnatural. They may succeed temporarily, but eventually the mind begins pulling them back toward the familiar identity, because identity always attempts to restore internal consistency. But when the three levels align, something remarkable begins happening. Your identity supports your thinking. Your thinking supports your actions, and your actions reinforce the identity. The system becomes self-sustaining. This is why some people seem to grow steadily, while others constantly restart their progress. The difference is not always effort. It is alignment. Designing a life that operates across all three levels begins with a simple shift in perspective. Instead of starting with actions, you begin with identity. You ask a deeper question. Not what should I do, but who am I becoming? Because once identity becomes clear, the other levels begin organizing themselves around it. Imagine someone deciding they are becoming a disciplined thinker. Not someone who occasionally tries to think clearly, but someone whose identity includes thoughtful observation. That identity begins influencing the mental level. The person becomes more aware of their thinking patterns. They notice assumptions forming. They observe emotional reactions before acting on them. Their thinking becomes more intentional. That thinking then shapes the physical level. Instead of reacting impulsively, they pause. Instead of following familiar habits, they question them. Instead of drifting through situations unconsciously, they engage with awareness. The identity supports the thinking. The thinking supports the action, and the action reinforces the identity. This is the alignment that transforms growth from a struggle into a system. But how do you begin practicing this alignment in everyday life? The answer begins with something surprisingly simple: observation. Observation is the bridge between identity and behavior. Without observation, patterns remain invisible. But with observation, patterns become adjustable. One of the most powerful daily mental practices you can develop is learning to observe your thinking before reacting. This may sound small, but it changes everything. Because most reactions happen automatically. Something happens. A thought appears. An emotion follows. Action occurs. All within seconds. Observation slows this process down. It creates space between stimulus and response. In that space, awareness appears. Instead of reacting immediately, you begin noticing the internal process unfolding. You notice the story your mind begins telling. You notice the assumptions forming beneath the surface. You notice the identity that thought may be protecting. And in that moment of observation, something powerful happens. You gain choice. Without observation, the mind follows its familiar scripts. With observation, the script becomes visible, and visible scripts can be rewritten. Over time, this practice begins strengthening your mental clarity. You become less reactive, less controlled by emotional impulses, more capable of responding thoughtfully instead of reacting automatically. And that leads to a deeper realization. The quality of your life is deeply connected to the quality of your thinking. Not just what you think about, but how you think, how you interpret events, how you respond to uncertainty, how you evaluate opportunities, how you manage internal dialogue. These patterns shape your perception of reality, which is why one of the most powerful questions you can ask yourself appears at the end of this chapter. A reflection that quietly influences everything moving forward. Take a moment and consider this carefully. What kind of thinker do you want to become? Not what kind of results you want. Not what kind of success you hope to achieve, but what kind of thinker you want to be. Do you want to become someone who observes before reacting? Someone who questions assumptions before believing them? Someone who sees challenges as information rather than threats? Someone who approaches life with curiosity rather than fear? Because the thinker you become will shape every decision you make. And those decisions will shape the life you experience. The most powerful personal transformations rarely begin with dramatic action. They begin with subtle shifts in thinking. Those shifts influence identity. That identity influences behavior. And behavior slowly reshapes reality. Designing a life across all three levels means becoming intentional about this process. Choosing an identity worth practicing. Developing thinking patterns that support that identity. Taking actions that reinforce both. Identity, thought, action. When these three levels align, growth stops feeling chaotic. Life stops feeling reactive. Instead, it begins operating like a system you are consciously building. And the more consciously you build that system, the more consistent your growth becomes. You begin realizing that transformation is not something that happens to you. It is something you design. One decision, one thought, one identity shift at a time. You've explored how identity shapes thinking. You've seen how thinking shapes behavior. And you've discovered how awareness allows you to design the system itself. But one final discovery still waits ahead. A discovery that changes how you view time, progress, and the direction of your life. Because once you understand the system of identity, thought, and action, another question naturally appears. If you can design the way you think, what kind of future could you create? You've learned how to align the three levels of your life. Now let's explore the long-term impact of living with that awareness. Chapter 10. Becoming the architect of your existence. There is a quiet moment in every transformation when the truth becomes undeniable. For most of your life, you may have believed that reality happens to you. That circumstances define your success, your failures, your possibilities. That life is something external, something you must respond to, adapt to, survive through. And for many people, this belief creates a subtle tension. They act, they plan, they try, but no matter how hard they work, life still feels heavy, unpredictable, resistant. But what if I told you the most powerful shift does not come from controlling the outside world? What if the real power is internal, the hidden architecture of your thoughts, beliefs, and identity? This is where you become the architect of your existence. Not in the sense of manipulating every circumstance, not in the sense of forcing outcomes, but in the sense of designing the internal framework that guides your experience. Imagine your mind as a vast structure. Every repeated thought is a brick. Every reinforced belief is a beam. Every assumption about who you are, every identity you practice, forms a hidden foundation. Over years, this structure feels permanent. But it is not permanent. It was built. And anything that was built can be redesigned. The first step in becoming the architect is awareness. Observe your thoughts before they dictate action. Notice the familiar identity scripts that subtly determine your responses. Pause. See them. Question them. The second step is intention. Ask yourself, who am I becoming? Design your thoughts around that identity. Choose interpretations, beliefs, and mental patterns that align with the person you wish to grow into. The third step is deliberate action. Small, repeated choices build the structure of your life brick by brick. Actions are the evidence your brain uses to reinforce identity. And as identity shifts, thought patterns and behaviors naturally reorganize. The moment you question an identity, you loosen its control. Repeat that to yourself. Let it settle. Because each time you challenge a limiting assumption, you create space for something new. Each time you pause instead of react, you add intention to your architecture. Each time you align a thought, action, and identity, you strengthen the blueprint of your life. And here's the most extraordinary part. You don't have to wait for perfect clarity, perfect confidence, or perfect circumstances. The process begins the moment you decide to see differently, the moment you observe, the moment you question, the moment you choose to act intentionally instead of automatically. This is the culmination of everything we've explored in this journey. You have seen how the three planes, physical, mental, spiritual, interact. You've discovered how identity quietly directs thought and action. You've practiced observing patterns and questioning old assumptions. You've aligned identity, thinking, and behavior to build momentum. And now, you stand at the threshold of intentional creation. The threshold where life stops happening to you and begins happening through you. The structure is clear. The foundation is laid. And the tools are in your hands. All that remains is for you to apply them, to continue designing, to continue building, and to continue becoming the person capable of crafting a reality that reflects your highest vision. And the most powerful part of this realization is that the process begins right now. Not someday, not next week, not when everything feels perfect. Right now, you are the architect, you are the designer, you are the conscious creator of your existence. And with this understanding, we step into the final reflection, the closing of this journey. A space to bring everything together, feel the expansion of possibility, and commit to the life you now know is possible. You are no longer reacting. You are designing. You are no longer a passenger. You are the architect of your reality. And this is the moment when all the insights, all the awareness, and all the identity shifts merge into a single powerful realization that your future begins the instant you choose to see differently. In closing, there comes a moment in every life when a quiet realization begins to take shape. A realization that the world you experience every day is not as fixed as it once appeared. For most of your life, reality probably felt external. Circumstances happened. Opportunities appeared or disappeared. Results seemed to arrive almost randomly. But now you can see something deeper. You are not simply living inside reality. You are participating in the creation of it. Through the physical plane, you experience outcomes. Through the mental plane, you generate the patterns that shape those outcomes. And through the spiritual plane, you define the identity that directs the mind itself. 3 planes, 3 levels of influence. And when these 3 begin working together, life stops feeling like a series of reactions. It begins to feel intentional. The clarity you seek becomes easier to access. The confidence you once thought you needed to force begins appearing naturally. Decisions that once felt confusing begin to feel obvious. Not because the world changed overnight, but because the level from which you are operating has changed. And this is where your real work begins. Because knowledge alone does not transform reality. Awareness must become action. So here is the challenge. Over the next few days, begin observing your life through the lens of the three planes. Notice the physical results around you. Notice the thoughts that repeat inside your mind. And most importantly, notice the identity quietly shaping both. Because the moment you begin seeing these patterns clearly, you gain the power to redesign them. And the moment you redesign those patterns, your entire experience of reality begins to change. Not slowly, but inevitably. You are not limited to reacting to the world that exists today. You are capable of shaping the world that will exist tomorrow. And that process begins the moment you choose to operate on all three planes of existence.